I'll be here for the first hour, and then Satya will come in for the second hour, and some of the other people who you heard giving talks this first week will also be a part of this. Will sort of come in and out. The format is quite open. You can raise your hand and make a comment, ask a question, or you can type something on the chat. We'll sort of keep it flowing and sort of adjust adjust how things based on how things go. Um, Before we start, okay, I see one comment saying the sound is very low. Is that true for everybody?
No, we can hear you very well, sir.
Okay, so
It's
then,
fine.
yeah, sir, it might just be your speaker. So if you would like to turn up the volume, things like that. So first of all, I want to start by apologizing a little bit for the confusion in terms of whether we were going to do this Saturday or Sunday. What happened was originally, as you know, it was scheduled on Saturday. And then there was some concern with some people saying, Saturday is a working day for some people and so on. And therefore, we thought we'd shift it to Sunday. But now, having shifted it to Sunday, I guess we're getting a lot of responses saying Sunday is a little bit of it's an off day. People have other commitments, personal, perhaps professional, and whatnot. So maybe what we'll do is from next week, let's go back and try Saturday and see how that works. And yeah, so we'll take it from there. So apologizing for the flip flop, but next week we'll try to do this on Saturday again. Okay. I also see one other comment on the chat from SS48. There's a request: can the presentations of Module 1 be made available? I will check with the code team because we create the content, the way it is delivered, etc., is up to code. Let me check with them and get back to you if that's okay. All right. So thanks for that comment. Okay. So with that, let me open the floor for any questions. I mean, particularly related to my module, since I'm here, but I can also take a few other questions from the other modules, and some of the other instructors will also sort of come in. Perhaps the best way to do it is to use the hand raise button that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And if you have a question or a comment, if you raise your hand, then we can go and turn so that everybody gets to ask their question or make their comment. Okay, great. Yeah, I do see a little bit of a discussion on Saturday versus Sunday. So what we'll do is during this week, the code team will try to figure out what works best for most people. And, again, it need not always be done in the mornings. We can also look at an evening slot if that works for people. But let's find something that at least the majority are comfortable with and go with that. Okay, so we will not take a decision right now. I'll let the code team do maybe an informal poll and figure out what works best. Yeah.
Sir, good morning. This is Sri Ganesh.
Yeah, Sri Ganesh.
Yeah. Sir, I attended your class yesterday. It was very informative, sir. You covered all the, business cases in different vertical of businesses. So it was very useful. One clarification I would like to ask is, supposing if organizations or corporates wanted to plant more samplings or trees and everything, how does it help in compensating the carbon neutral? Like you said, sequestering carbon is possible. Is there a calculation where corporates can take benefit out of it?
Yeah. So thank you. That's an excellent question. And this is a topic that I think we're also going to cover in some subsequent modules, not specifically how do I calculate the carbon, but this issue of measurement. And I think I might have mentioned it in module 1 or in week 1. But the point is, if we don't measure, then there is absolutely no idea whether what we are emitting and what we are absorbing are matching each other or not, right? So you're absolutely right. There is no point just planting a Miyawaki forest or whatever it is and feeling good about it. There is also the point also is to be able to measure what we are actually doing. So there are a couple of ways that we do measurement. So one sort of topic is what we call life cycle analysis of various processes, and we'll try to sort of look at carbon emission measurement, etc. There'll be a little bit of, I think, in week 2 or in week 3, we'll spend quite some time on the mechanics of life cycle analysis and how we go about doing this for different kinds of industries, all of that. That's one part of it. But the second, which is related to what you're saying, is how do I actually measure the impact of of planting trees? So what really happens is we are looking at, when you have trees, you are looking at a certain amount of biomass that captures carbon, and based on the actual size of what you're planting, and also the type, whether you're planting a mango sapling or whatever, there is there are these database tables that are available that allow you to sort of compute, saying this is so a mango tree that is sort of this big with leaf surface areas of something like this is the extent to which it will sequester carbon on an annual basis. So you can actually perform those calculations. We did some research a little bit some time ago looking at something called urban and peri-urban farming, and tried to sort of say, if in urban spaces we can look at, or just around urban spaces, if we sort of do a little bit of farming, it could be terrace gardening, etc., what will be the impact on both carbon sequestration as well as what we call land surface temperature, and use these kinds of formulae. I'm trying to, as we talk about this, seeing if I can just open up that paper and I can just show you a couple of graphics in terms of how we actually went about doing that calculation. But there is you have databases that you can use to understand the total quantum of biomass and therefore the amount of carbon that it will capture. Okay, so I'll just stop there with that. I'll search for this paper as we are discussing, and as and when I find it on my computer, I'll just share my screen.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Yeah. So that database link is also, if you can share it, that might be useful.
Yeah, sure. And I can share the paper also, and that will have the information to that to the link and so on. I can have the code team send it to all of you.
Excellent.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, let's start with, so while I try to retrieve that paper, we've got a few hands up. So let's start with SS48. And again, I apologize because on my screen, most of you appear as SS this and SS that. It's sort of like just a number. But when you ask a question, so earlier, Sri Ganesh, I mean, your name appears as Sri Ganesh. I was able to identify who you were. For the others, as you ask your question, my request is, can you also please just introduce yourself so I know who SS48 or SS94 is. So we'll start with SS48, please.
Yeah, this is Ramachandran here. Rama, as probably you might know, I was in India, this IEAC cell earlier with IIT. I have a question regarding the session which was done by Professor Satya.
Okay.
Would you want to take it up, or should I give it?
Satya is coming. So Satya, we have a 2-hour session. So I said I'll do the first hour. Satya will come for the second hour. So
Fine.
I would suggest that let's hold that question and let Satya come in a little bit later.
I'll do that.
Yeah, thanks. SS94, please.
Hello, I'm Sandeep Shah. My question is, then you said that for the carbon sequestering, you have the paper, and this based on the surface area, based on the age of the trees, how much carbon sequestering can be done. So does this criteria which is being used is internationally accepted?
Yeah, look, so that's a great question. So unfortunately, the short answer is no. So what's happening is there is a lot of R&D that's happening here in terms of, so there is a lot of empirical research that goes into how much carbon is actually being captured by various kinds of, plants. And then the question also is, of course, there are, the same plant growing in two different geographies might actually grow very differently, right? So for instance, if you take a palm tree that grows in India versus a palm tree that grows in Kerala, sometimes the shape and size and so on are a little bit different. So
yeah, exactly.
It cannot just be for a palm tree use this factor. Right, so you will have to come up with a little bit more nuance in terms of, given this kind of a leaf size or whatever, or give this kind of an overall surface area or volume, this is sort of the factor. So there is constant R&D that's sort of happening in this field with people doing empirical work. Until that is done and some standardization is brought by, you will not find this universal applicability. So hopefully one of the next stages for something like this is that scientific research matures to a point where everybody agrees that these are the formula that ought to be used. So that's sort of where we are. You'll see that even in life cycle analysis, which we do, many of the factors that we use to figure out emissions of various processes, industrial processes, construction processes, etc., we may not necessarily have data from India because nobody has done the calculation. So we may actually end up borrowing from databases elsewhere, where, I mean, the answer will not be completely wrong, but those processes, the transportation, etc., is a little bit different. If you borrow data from the US or the UK or within the EU or something like that. So that the issue that you've brought up in terms of how do we calculate, do we have consensus, is a sticky issue. It is an issue on which a lot of R&D is being done. With regards to the biomass kind of calculation, I mean, there are some sort of published formulae, but on the other hand, with the materials, for instance, there are these things like product category rules and various other kinds of standards that are being evolved that tell you how you should measure, and hopefully those then become standardized.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah, SS8, please.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Rahul Agarwal here. Am I audible?
Yeah, Rahul, you're audible.
Okay. So, my thing is on the video that the last one that we had, business case for sustainability. The thing here is that the example that you actually shared that on the cement manufacturing process, most of the cement manufacturing companies are covered under the DCs, designated customers for companies for the EC Act, Energy Conservation Act.
Yeah.
So that's kind of mandatory for them. My question actually here is that most of the companies, and I've been part of manufacturing industry for almost like 3 decades, to cut down the cost of their, the energy intensity and whatever we say from the profit perspective, people have been doing that for ages. How much of the activity that they're doing now, that sustainability has become an important point from a sustainability perspective, something for the nature versus something for the profit.
Right. So I think when we look at the cement industry, and by the way, also ask Satya this question because he's also done some work on cement. There are broadly 2 parts to it. There is the process part where we consume energy, and we're trying to, of course, reduce energy through more efficient mechanisms, changing our sources, etc. Right. So that's one part. But the other part is that just the way in which we produce cement, when you take calcium carbonate and try to take calcium oxide out of it, you emit CO2. So this has nothing to do with what kind of energy you're using. Just, there is to produce a certain quantum of cement, ordinary Portland cement, if you will, there's a certain quantum of CO2 that's being emitted. So when you look at the cement industry and trying to reduce carbon, you have to reduce on both ends. You've got to try to make it more energy efficient, and also the energy sources need to be as clean as possible so that the footprint of the process comes down. But also we have to start looking at what do we do to minimize the amount of CO2 that is generated in sort of this process of limestone being converted into calcium oxide, which is reduction on the product side. So on the product side, there are several, strategies. One simple strategy that has been around for quite some time is trying to use things like fly ash in cement and bringing down the overall, cement content and, things like that. Now that's what we call Portland pozzolanic cement and things like this. But there are also other sort of more evolving low carbon cements, LC3, low calcined, clay cement and these kinds of things. So on the one hand, there is some amount of innovation that's happening here. Now, to your question on percentages, what seems to be happening is that many of these cement companies now have a green cement line, but clearly the market is not quite ready for for these green cements for a variety of reasons, partly also being that the specifications are written in such a way that you tend to go for the very traditional cement. Right, for instance, recently we were doing some work with a precast manufacturer. He says, the kind of strength gain that I need for precast manufacturing, I need to go with the typical ordinary Portland cement, right, which is your high emission cement from the product side. So very little is happening at the moment, but hopefully going forward that will increase. There has been a little bit more action, as you rightly point out, on the energy side of things, right, on the process side of things, where there has been some amount of reduction. But again, I don't know if there has been a good cross industry study that has actually been done to quantify. Just off the top of my head, I think we've probably reduced emissions just on the energy side by something in the order of maybe 10 to 15%. But I think there is a long way to go. And on the other side, on the product side, I think is where the big questions lie, because you can decarbonize the energy side of it sooner or later. But on the product side of it, we need to really think about how we write our specifications so that we essentially incentivize people to use low carbon cements, in the actual casting or pouring of columns, beams, slabs, and things like that. Okay,
Yeah,
I hope.
basically, I was trying to get to something like, uh, how do we differentiate between true sustainability versus greenwashing kind of a stuff
Yeah.
across
So
the
maybe.
industry? That was my question. Yeah.
Correct. And that's, I think, what we're going to look at, I think, next week or the week after. I'll have to check on the whole. I think the only thing that we have to sort of start looking at a life cycle analysis based approach where we actually measure the carbon that is being emitted or greenhouse gases that are being emitted per ton of cement. And essentially say, how do we bring that down? Right. So we have to set benchmarks. So today we have to figure out what the average is, and then sort of challenge manufacturers to be 10% below the average. Perhaps there has to be a policy push that incentivizes you to, maybe there are some credits that are given of some form, etc. And then over a period of time, we've got to start bringing that down. If we don't benchmark using a life cycle approach, then what you're left with is greenwashing, which is primarily people saying that they have these lines of cement. Most manufacturers today put out their own data in terms of what is being emitted, and you will see a wide fluctuation. Cement at the end of the day is cement, right? So you can't have that much of fluctuation, but because there is no auditing of what people are calculating or how people are calculating, we have a wide range of variability. So I think this benchmarking exercise, an independent audit of your process, is essentially the only way to stop greenwashing. Otherwise, people claim what they will claim, and in addition, they will say, "Look, I planted some trees, I put some solar panels on various installations, I contributed to the local school, and so I'm doing all of these sustainability related issues," which, by the way, are good. There's nothing wrong with any of these, absolutely. But you don't really know how much of an impact it has until you measure. So maybe let's revisit this discussion again in a week or so, once we've looked at life cycle analysis, and see if that potentially solves the challenge that you're posing, which is very pertinent.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, Arjun Menon.
Hello, sir. Good morning. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay, so just I had a doubt with the sir, actually regarding the 7 environmentally sustainable strategy. So the fifth one was extend product durability. So it just struck me that earlier, maybe 20, 30 years back, when it comes to designing and manufacturing an automobile, uh, the life cycle of that used to be quite substantial, like maybe 15, 20, or 20 years maybe. But nowadays we have seen that the automobile manufacturers, to keep the cost within a cap, they have reduced the product durability, I can say, by using lighter gauge metals and plastics. So isn't that little bit contradicting the sustainability strategy?
Yeah, so excellent point. So again, I think one of the things that I also wanted, I don't know, I don't recall if I made this point when I gave the talk, is that sometimes when you push one lever down, another one sort of goes up. So on the one hand, manufacturers will say, "Hey, I'm actually using lesser material now because my entire body is lighter and so on. So it's thinner elements that I'm using. So I'm actually consuming lesser material. So my material intensity comes down." But as you're rightly pointing out, today the product durability also perhaps comes down because of that reason, or because of several other reasons. I think it's also because models today, evolve very, very fast, that a model becomes outdated very quickly. I think back in the day, you could be driving a 10-year-old Ambassador car, right, 30, 40 years ago, and it may not be very different technologically from something that was just manufactured. Whereas today, the difference between a 10-year-old vehicle and today's is just chalk and cheese in terms of the kinds of electronics that are there, features and things like that. And that forces people to change quickly, even though your car could potentially be used for another few years. Because it is becoming obsolete, you sort of change. So I think that's one thing is to understand, is that there is a trade-off. But the second is, and we'll talk about this in the last week as well, business model that companies use has a lot to sort of do in terms of trying to figure out what incentives you offer to becoming more sustainable. If I were an auto manufacturer and I sort of made money based on the margins of selling every vehicle, and I would like to sell as many vehicles as possible, then it's it's a very simple issue, right? If the vehicle is less durable and needs to be replaced every 5 years, that's good for me because then I make a sale every 5 years. If it is if it sort of takes 10 years, then I make a sale only every 10 years, right? And so that's not as good for me. But if you start moving the business model, for instance, from a product oriented business model to a service oriented business model, or more of an ownership business model, then you see that the incentives change a little bit. So one of the examples in project durability, if I recall correctly, I'm going to look at my slides in a second, was this company called Interize that I'm also involved with, and that's why I know a little bit about what they're doing. And the Interize is essentially, you have all of these roads in the country that for several years have been let out as public-private partnerships, right? Which means it's a private operator who owns and operates the road, right? So it's not just a product, it's not just a contractor coming and laying the road. The operator is also on the hook for quality and maintenance over a 20-year period or a 30-year period. And Interize is a company that essentially has aggregated and owns a bunch of roads. So it is not a product company, it's really more of a service company. And as a service company, you think more about durability, because the more durable the product is, the less service that you will have to provide, and therefore the less the expenses are. So one way to look at these contradictions is to also think about, can companies start changing their business models? Right. So in this case, can we start looking at more, lease kind of models rather than owning kind of models in the auto industry? Right. And will that therefore incentivize people to start producing more vehicles that are more durable? Because the more durable they are, and if you're in charge of maintaining it, the easier it is for you. Right. So it's an excellent trade-off that you've pointed out, but that's sort of my response on how we would look at it.
Okay, thank you,
Yeah.
sir. So just one more question related to this reducing the material intensity. So you had mentioned about that company AI Bono and precast materials and composites used in aircraft. So
Yeah.
basically about the lightweight structures. Now we are, be it the aerospace industry or be it the automobile or even the consumer industry, we are moving from a traditionally a metal-based manufacturing towards a more composite-based manufacturing, like composite materials like a resin, carbon fiber, or a glass fiber type construction. My only concern is that uh, now, if it is the aluminium, means we can be processing it from bauxite or something. But if you are making a composite material, let's say a glass fiber or a carbon fiber laminate, there is a process involved for manufacturing the resin, the fibers. That is one, and about the sustainability of that. Then finally, when talking about a circular economy, the main concern about composites is that its recyclability. And if suppose like let's say an aircraft or something happens to crash, which is made of composite, the fumes which it emits, it's again more polluting than a metal-based metal manufactured aircraft. So this is, I mean, I'm more
No, no.
conservative towards metals, but then industry is adopting composites. So that's why this question came. Thank you.
You're absolutely right. So the point that you're making is that it's not just the volume of material, right? And that's why we've sort of labeled that thing. It's not reduce material volume. It is reduce material intensity, which also ideally takes into account, the energy that you put in to process that material to bring it to a point where it can be used in the finished product, right? So you're right. I might be shifting to a different material. I might have very low quantities of it, but producing even that low quantity could be far more energy intensive than producing larger quantities of the traditional metal. Again, this is where tools like life cycle analysis come in, where you can actually do that comparison. And you can say, look, what is the ideal trade-off between reducing material volume and reducing material intensity? So you're right. It's not just reducing volume. It's also reducing intensity. Okay, we've got quite a few hands raised, so I'm just going to go in order. I know there are a few comments on the chat as well, and I'll get to that also in a second. But I'd request Mr. Subramaniam Somasundara, to go next.
Good morning, sir. This is Somasundaram from Coimbatore. I'm representing Aquasub Engineering, the Texmo Pumps Manufacturing Company. My question is, to calculate the carbon footprint with respect to scope 2, how much CO2 should be considered for 1 unit of electricity, internationally accepted quantity? And the number 2 is carbon sequestration. You already explained something on that. So if we have hundreds of acres of land, we can cultivate more, we can plant more trees. If we develop more trees, how can we calculate the internationally accepted um, carbon net zero calculations? You throw some light.
So good question, sir. Again, I'm not sure I have those numbers off the top of my head, but from the energy perspective, I think it of course depends a little bit on what is the mix of energy that you're using. So clearly, if you have 70% coming from the traditional coal-fired power plants versus 30% coming from renewable, you'll have a certain factor. If it is 90-10, 80-20, 50-50, whatever it is there. And also, again, in some cases it's you're consuming electricity, in other cases you may be consuming fuel, you may be consuming diesel and so on. So typically, I mean, people essentially use basic stoichiometric chemical equations, right? So you can sort of say, if I burn diesel, this is sort of the chemical sort of chemical formula for that, and this is the amount of CO2. So per 1 mole of diesel, this is the amount of CO2 that's being emitted, and so on. And so you have these sort of balanced equations, which we feel are universally accepted, because the chemical equation is the same, whether you are doing that burning in South America or whether you're doing it sort of in Asia. And then based on the quantum, if for 1 mole it is so much, depending on the amount of diesel that you consume. So when you use, for instance, these LCA software, there are several open LCA, CIMA Pro, Gabi, whatever. They all have these inbuilt databases which basically take these stoichiometric equations and use them for calculation. I don't, off the top of my head, have the exact conversion value of liters of diesel or megawatts of fossil fuel powered electricity and its conversion into greenhouse gases, but we can look that up quite easily. And the second one you said, yeah, absolutely, how do we calculate? Again, I just sort of I have this paper up, I'm just looking at it. Unfortunately, I have a bunch of databases and references, but I think the particular formula, I have it as a maybe let me share my screen. Just give me a second. Yeah, just let me know if you can see a PDF document.
Yeah, I can see that, sir.
Yeah, okay. So essentially what we sort of did is, let me try to see if I can show you some pictures of so essentially we did these simulations. You can see this is for Chennai and Bangalore, what the city looked like in the past, what it will look like in the present, and also then simulated a little bit of this into the future. And as you can see, what's happening is a little bit of the opposite of what all of you are trying to do. All of you are trying to plant trees, but here you find that the green and blue areas, which are the existing trees and water bodies, etc., are obviously getting eaten up by this urban expansion, right? So there are some probabilistic models using satellite imagery that we've used to do this. Then the question was to look at this kind of data. Where is the right, where we are actually able to calculate the growth of biomass in and in this case what we said is, if we put in some peri-urban farming or if we put in some urban farming, then what would happen differently? There would be slightly greater increase in biomass. And based on that, let me see, this is land surface temperature, and right? So yeah, so here's the equation. Sorry. Right. So there are some sort of equations that are reported in the literature where the amount of carbon sequestered is uh, is a proportion of the total biomass that is available. So depending on the total biomass that is available, you have some of these equations. This is referred to in a paper here, this Chavan and Rasal sort of paper, and I can provide the reference to you. But these are the kinds of references that one can use to sort of understand for various kinds of trees and plants what is the amount of biomass that's being captured. Okay.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Hope you will share that link if possible. We
I'll
can go
share
through
that
all
link.
the
Yeah, yeah.
details.
I will send it through the code team. So maybe we'll take. So let me just. There are a few questions on the chat. So if that's okay, before we take more questions here, let me quickly just go through them. So one question is on databases. I've said I'll provide some of these references. That was SS57's questions. SS10's question was. Even Vera is not very clear on the distinction between census and area-based approaches. So could you please clarify how we can develop a robust system for the Indian context? Assistant, I'm going to ask you to have to maybe sort of ask that question and sort of explain that a little bit more so I can answer. Sri Ganesh's question is, so CO2 and methane and a few other gases are essentially termed greenhouse gases because they essentially serve to trap the amount of solar radiation coming in, which is essentially the greenhouse effect, and that's what warms the planet. So CO2, of course, is everyone talks about CO2. It's probably the most popularly talked about greenhouse gas, but see, methane also, essentially does performs a very similar function, and that's why we lump all of those together and call them greenhouse gases. SS48 says the name appears automatically. If the organizers can guide us how to change it, that will be great. Okay, I'll let you figure that out with the organizers. SS18 Miyawaki garden concept. Look, I'm not an experience on Miyawaki gardens or Miyawaki forests. I just sort of said I know a lot of people plant this because supposedly there are good impacts that come out of it. But I think we'll have to find somebody else who is an expert. My simple point is there's no point just planting it unless you're able to measure exactly how much it is sequestering. Okay. Then I think this is a response that, yes, I mean, we talked about car industry and people replacing cars, but, phones, it's even worse, right? Because you tend to change your phone every year sometimes, even if the phone is working because the newer models sort of come in. And that does impact durability. So like I said, again, if you're going to look at phones as a product, I think you'll have a problem. If you look at phones as a service, I think you'll have probably people thinking a little bit more about durability. Okay. Right. So Hussein Patpia has some information on, converting biomass into carbon dioxide. Then there's a question on solar PV. What will happen after 25 years? Do we need to produce and install these? Again, just wait for Satya because he does a lot of work on energy. I'm going to let him answer that. Hussein has has sort of given a response to this. Aluminum is more sustainable. So do we need to look at the sustainable so this is SS7. That's an interesting question. Aluminum is more sustainable owing to its recycle and reusable nature, but it has more carbon footprint for production than other materials. So how do we sort of look at this? And I think this is where you have to take a life cycle perspective, where you also take the entire. So for instance, if you want to build a shutter with aluminum, then you have to take into account not only the first cost or initial embodied energy of building building that aluminum shutter, but also the overall operational energy over the life cycle, which is the amount of energy that you will need to for maintenance, for repair, things like that. And generally, if aluminum ends up being a little bit more durable and sustainable, you will find that even though from an initial embodied energy perspective it is not as well off, from an overall life cycle perspective it actually works out better, because even though you have a large initial blip, over a period of time that gets amortized over several years, right? So I think the life cycle perspective is critical. We're going to talk about that in a subsequent class. Um, right. Socio-cultural dimensions are very complex. How can one measure their impact on the environment? Are there any references? What parameters can we consider? Okay, that is, I think, unfortunately, when we look at sustainability, and I made this point in my video when we talked about the triple bottom line, there's the economics, there's the environmental part, there's the people part. The economics part is quite straightforward. We've been calculating that kind of thing for years. Now the environmental part is starting to become a little bit quantitative because you've got these techniques like life cycle analysis and so on. But what's happening is, as far as the social side is concerned, we've just not paid enough attention to measuring. Right. Of course, we do measure things in certain ways. We, for instance, say, this water purification intervention will have an impact on so many villages. But to what extent will it have an impact? What will be the reduction in the infection rates of people who are falling sick? Therefore, what will be the productivity increase in the village and potential extra income that they earn because more people are working without being sick? I think these are studies that still ought to be done. Okay, so there are no ready references there. And then the challenge is huge, says SS87. Need to take measures. Government should ensure resources are protected. So absolutely, right? So again, I just recorded a lecture for the very last module where we talk about exactly this, right? What is the role of the private sector? What is the role of government? And what is the role of individuals, right? How do you, so that's one. And then the second part is, how do you influence individuals to behave more sustainably? How do we influence businesses to behave more sustainably? And how do you influence governments to enact policies that push forward sustainability? Right. So again, I request you to hold that question a little bit. We'll get to that discussion a little bit later. So then Sandeep has a question on cement, or a point on cement decarbonization, increase of what are economically viable carbon capture techniques in addition to these, right? So there is sort of, you can mineralize and capture CO2. Again, the person to talk to would be either today or a little bit later, might be my colleague, Professor Rajneesh Kumar. And Rajneesh is sort of a carbon capture sort of expert. And there have been studies where you try to mineralize and capture the carbon dioxide in the cement, which seem to be quite promising. Okay. All right. 87 again says, at an individual level, again, I think it comes down to benchmarks that we have to set, and we've not set any yet. And I think that's the biggest problem. We need, so when we talk about life cycle analysis, you'll realize that there is an ISO standard, and we should be using these ISO standards to calculate standardized values for a variety of activities. And then deciding, people can then decide which one they want to use, either intrinsically, altruistically, they can become more sustainable, or you can provide tax and credits as intense incentives for people and businesses to become more sustainable, and so on. Okay. All right. So I'm going to skip a little bit back to the in-person questions. Again, I apologize, we may not be able to get through all the questions today, but let's go ahead and do as many as we can. I guess the one on top right now is SS99.
Hi, good morning, Professor Ashwin Mahalingam. I'm G. Jagan from Flex Chennai. So my topic is around sustainability based profitability. So in our process, we generate quite a lot of total material loss. Let's say 1 to 2% of scrap is getting generated from raw material to finished good stage. And usually as per the process, we will be selling this to some of the vendor based on their quote and the bidding process. So will it be considered as a sustainability as we dispose all non-recyclable products from the process? Another aspect is, I understand producing virgin material is more profitable than recycling. So I will come very specific to the topic now. So do we have any example in electronic manufacturing where e-waste is regenerated? To be very precise, so we talk about will to waste, let's say the material losses in terms of raw material or finished goods, energy depletion, electricity, HVAC systems, all consumes 20% of your profitability. Is there any benchmark study available where sustainability is taken as a green line? It can add up to 2 to 5% of the profitability. So if you can highlight any best practices available in disposal waste recovery, that would be appreciated.
Okay, let me, so several good points there. Let me sort of provide a few comments. So first of all, the question is, why is virgin material cheaper than recycled material? And partly that's because of the maturity of the supply chain. So generally, we have this concept in economics called economies of scale, which is you have a fixed cost and a variable cost. The fixed cost is there whether you produce 1 unit or 100 units. So if you produce 100 units, even though there is a variable cost for each of the 100 units, the share of the fixed cost comes down. So the overall price comes down. So the more you manufacture, the more you scale, you get these economies of scale because the fixed cost then gets divided by a large number of items or elements. The problem today in many of these sustainability technologies is the order sizes are not very high for a variety of reasons, because of which your costs end up being higher because your fixed costs are quite high given the amount that you're producing, and overall it becomes non-competitive. So it's a bit of a chicken and an egg, right? So only when the market picks up will the prices of recycled materials come down. But in order for the market to pick up, the prices of the recycled material should be down, right? So it's a little bit of chicken and the egg. So this is where I think some of us strongly feel that in many of these areas a strong policy push is required. So for instance, we take off GST or something like that on some of these products, or put it to a lower category or whatever, so instead, so that you artificially lower the cost, or you provide some kind of a credit subsidy. Today, for instance, we know that farmers get their electricity for free. So can you provide free electricity for some of these kinds of recycling industries and so on? And hopefully that will then create momentum in the market that will help people push the prices down, and then these technologies become more competitive. So there are there are not that many examples that I can think of. I mean, like I said earlier, later on we'll talk a little bit about say the Aditya Birla Group. For instance, their fashion and retail vertical, they try to do a lot of this, right? So old clothes, for instance, they try to sort of bring those back in and try to reuse the same material for newer clothes, because again, it is fabric and so on, and they've done a reasonably good job. I think that's one interesting sort of story of being able to sort of recycle and upcycle and things like that. Rab. So yeah, so I think I'll stop my comment there so that we have time for other questions. But I hope that somewhat addressed what you were talking about. Yeah, can we move on to SS 44, please? 47, sorry, 47.
Good morning, Professor, and good morning to the team.
Good morning.
Professor, so far we have been discussing sustainability and the measurements from the production or manufacturing perspective. So my interest would be on the supply chain and logistics, where the scope 3 emissions will be measured and reported. So just want to understand, will that also be covered during our discussions?
Yeah, there
And
is a module on ESG. I believe that's next week, and so we will talk a little bit more about that. But again, the thing about scope 3 is, I think the way I look at it is, scope 3 for you is actually scope 2 or scope 1 for someone else.
someone on else, correct.
And really, I think it is very, very difficult for you to calculate scope 3 because it's not your data, right? And it's not your process, right? You're essentially saying, I will calculate someone else's scope 1 or scope 2. So, I think the thing is that we've got to move towards everyone calculating their own scope 1 or scope 2. Then some of that data can be directly taken by you to make it scope 3. Otherwise, the scope 3, and we, even at IIT, we hire some consultants who say all kinds of things. I mean, they once told us that only the travel that a faculty takes to go to a conference or whatever is scope 3 emissions. Right now, that is one part of scope 3. Obviously, if I'm traveling on an airline and things like that, but that is not the only scope 3. So and partly it's because that is easy to calculate, because you can figure out from airlines what fuel they're using. If you're going from here to Delhi, what is your footprint and things like that. But there is far more in terms of being able to sort of calculate that we have to think through. Okay, so yeah, I think we'll have to sort of build capability on conducting this kind of life cycle analysis down the line if we are to be really successful with scope 3 is my sort of feeling on this.
Okay, Professor. Thanks. I'll have more
Right.
questions when the session comes up.
Yeah. I'm sure there will be several. So yeah, we'll take as many as we can. SS 53.
Thank you.
Yeah, hello sir. Good morning. I'm Hanisham. I'm from Chennai and I'm SAP EHS and sustainability consultant. So I have a question related to the reporting standards and adopting changes. So when it comes to sustainability reporting, there are multiple factors which makes a lot of changes and periodical updates in terms of matrices, targets, ambitions with respect to the regions and across lines of businesses. For example, now recently PFA, PFAS, which has been identified by US environmental protection agencies with respect to Teflon. So kind of lot of updates are going on, with respect to product safety and stewardship for manufacturing.
Yeah.
But how the companies can adapt to these changes with respect to their actionable targets? Because in larger firms, the management of change is playing a major role in applying the actions. Even for getting the change requires a lot of approvals to make a change with respect to the actions that can provide results with respect to the targets. So how the companies could adapt to the changes in manufacturing sectors?
Yeah. So you're obviously asking $1 million question, right? Because we all realize that it is companies that really do work. They manufacture things, they transport things, they install things. So the whole sustainability agenda is really an agenda that's aimed at businesses. And how do you sort of bring about change is sort of an issue. There are sometimes changes happen from there's sort of two sort of theories. One is the top down theory, where change comes from the top, and that comes because you're exporting to Europe, and the Europeans have said that they will not take in your product because of its carbon
See
footprint, and
that,
then you have to right. So you have these kinds of sort of regulations, etc., and that forces a top-down sort of focus on sustainability. But the other sort of route is the bottom-up route. All right, and in the bottom-up route, there are two things that are important. One is the people on the shop floor or on the construction site or wherever need to first understand sustainability and be able to champion it. Second is it needs to sort of make economic sense. So there has to be a business case that is made up for it from a net present value or an internal rate of return kind of perspective. Then I think when you take such a thing to middle management or top management, they're at least likely to listen to it carefully. So I think both of these are important, building that basic understanding of sustainability, particularly from a quantitative perspective. And secondly, being able to justify over a long-term period what is the financial gain because of these kinds of sustainability measures. And again, in my experience, you should be able to do that. Sustainability measures normally pay off at least over a period of time. They may not pay off immediately, but over a period of time, they could certainly pay off.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
Okay, excellent. SS 62.
Hi, sir. This is Vineet. So, I was recently reading a report by World Economic Forum on what's the contribution of building in the total emissions from an urban area, and they contribute close to 50 to 70%. So, I wanted to understand how far can digital twins can help us in keeping track of emissions and coming up with measures to bring down the emissions by running simulations and stuff. So, do you
Yeah,
see
so I
the
think
current? Yeah.
Yeah. Again, I think so. There are two parts to this, right? There is the embodied energy within a building. There is an operational energy within the building. I think digital twins can help in both, but your question is a little bit more towards operational energy. And
Yeah.
yeah, I think, first of all, buildings can be more efficient with digital twins because you're getting constant data in terms of what's happening on the building. And therefore, you can use the digital twin to analyze and then inform the various building management systems in terms of, do you want to increase the cooling, decrease the cooling, depending on the concentration of people in the building, etc. So I think from the operational perspective, digital twins have a very important role to play. Yeah, so I think that's how I see how I see digital twins sort of playing a part. So they have multiple roles, a digital twin, because there's also an asset management service that they provide, and that is also important because you can sort of tell when you need to replace certain assets, and every time you replace an asset, you're emitting a little bit of carbon because you're manufacturing or buying the replacement. So it's not just energy efficiency. I think also from an asset management perspective, a digital twin can be used to keep track, come up with a little bit of a whatever, a passport, an energy passport or whatever of a building.
Yes, sir. I also wanted to point one more information that you were talking about, like planting like trees within the urban space and stuff. So I've done some little bit research on this particular topic, and I found out that urbanization tends to shift the precipitation, basically influence the spatial distribution of precipitation. So like planting more trees in urban areas, let's say in Chennai, it could actually bring about a different spatial distribution of precipitation, and then in turn affect the hydrology also. So that is also something which we have to take care. Yeah.
You're absolutely correct. And because all of this relates to the aerosol concentration in the atmosphere and what that does to the formation of water droplets and so on, there's quite a bit of research that's going on at IIT Madras on that subject. So you're absolutely, and this is where I think even earlier when we discussed that project durability, I can't emphasize enough that this is a system. Just because you solve one part of the system doesn't mean that the rest of the system is functioning exactly the way it was before.
Exactly.
Right? So it's all interconnected that we have to sort of think about. Okay, excellent. SS16 and SS36. I see you have a question. Is it? Can you see right at the bottom of your screen a raise hand function? If you can click that, you'll be in queue. Meanwhile, SS16, go ahead.
Good morning, sir. This is Niranjana. I have a basic question. So, going through all the modules, starting from waste management or water management, so it talks about various kinds of technology which helps us in accelerating sustainability initiatives, say it desalination or recycling of waste. But it also talks about the fact that it involves a lot of energy. It's an energy-intensive process, and in terms of materials, resources, cost-wise, energy, and it's also affecting socially the people around them. So by displacing, if you're going to have a new desalination plant or waste energy plant, it's definitely going to displace few people. So in all the three angles, it's going to affect. So my question is, so plastics right now, it's very cheap. So that's why everyone is opting for it. And as you said, there is already technology in place for plastic. So easily we're able to manufacture it. So basically change is something difficult to incorporate from what we already have the technology ready for it. So going for alternatives, even the alternative brands are not getting appreciated. The same thing goes to cement or whatever might be the sector which you're talking about. So my thought was, why don't we add this factor, like the cost factor, which takes into account the difficulty in recycling plastic, or the energy factor, which takes in recycling it. So why don't we add that cost to the plastic itself, so that the overall cost increases and people also gain awareness. And if the cost increases, because only the cost is the factor which people can easily relate to. So when we increase the cost, then automatically they will stop buying that product. So is there any policy which can be incorporated for it?
No, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. And if you recall, the Tamil Nadu government, for instance, used this, banned this use of single-use plastic in stores and stuff like that. I mean, didn't quite ban it, but we moved to a system where we said the plastic bag will not be provided for free, right? And so if a plastic bag is provided, then they will add 2 rupees, 5 rupees, whatever onto it. Maybe it's had some impact, but I think it depends a little bit on what is the quantum of the cost that you're adding, right? So there, I think there are different demographics. For certain people, a 3 to 5 rupee raise pinches the pocket. For others, unless you raise by 500 to 1,000 rupees, they will not really tell. So it's difficult to do this on a one size fits all. But I think that's what we call the marginal pricing. The marginal pricing has to be something that pinches the pocket of the group of consumers that are the largest sort of consumers of that particular this thing. So you're right. There has to be some kind of a carrot and stick mechanism. The stick maybe is the increase in cost, which comes through some kind of a policy prescription. But it's not as simple as it sounds. So I think that's why we need to look at all three. We need to look at behavioral change at the individual level. How can we sort of stop using plastics, if possible? So for instance, if you're going to buy something from a nearby grocery store, wouldn't it be better for you to walk and bring it rather than to Swiggy or Dunzo? Because then it comes in more packaging and more material and so on. So there is individual change that we'll have to look at. Then there is the kind of corporate business change, which again relies on the business model. But in this case, then the third lever is policy change. So there's individuals, corporates, and government. And at the government level, then you can do these kinds of ban plastics in stores and things like this.
Okay, one more additional question. Sorry. I want to talk about this decentralization. So instead of having centralized systems, so how about bringing decentralized technology in terms of waste management? Like individual houses, we have this concept of rainwater harvesting. Same way, why can't decentralized waste management? But that's very difficult to implement, like laying composters or bringing that or putting it in the practical implementation is becoming very difficult. Same way, if I say if all the houses are empowering it with individual solar panels, would that be much more beneficial in terms of cost-wise and sustainability impact than through these coal-powered plants? Any study has been done that is powering all the houses with solar compared to getting electricity through coal-based?
Yeah. So one of the things we have to understand with solar, for instance, is that what you're doing is you're generating power during the day and you're supplying it into the grid, right? And then the grid supplies power back to you whenever you sort of need it. So it's a little bit of an illusion in the sense you're not using that solar power directly in most cases. Power generated goes into the grid. Some power comes from the grid. And typically, during the day, there may be some balancing, but during the night, power is not being generated by solar. So unless you're actually storing solar, power is actually coming in from conventional sources, right? So that is something that from a solar perspective you have to sort of look at. There has been a lot of research on this thing called microgrids, where right now the grid is supplying electricity for, say, the whole city, right? So when you generate power using solar, you send it to that grid, and then the grid sends back some power to you. But if you can make a microgrid for an apartment or for a group of apartments where the power that is generated essentially stays there, then you are likely to be a little bit more sustainable, in my opinion, right? There was
Off-grid
another
systems
sort of
won't work out. Okay.
huh?
Off-grid systems won't work out. That is, can't we be fully energy independent without coal-based? Can we
That's
rely completely on solar?
essentially that's a microgrid, but there is
Microgrid. Okay.
there is an investment that goes into that.
Okay.
Right. So and that's where the point is, the grid is large, so there are already economies of scale. Your microgrid is small, right, and therefore you don't necessarily have economies of scale. So either you should
Thank you,
have
sir.
customers that are so passionate about sustainability that they're willing to pay, or right, so or you have to subsidize it in some manner. And your composting, etc. Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of composting that a lot of households do today, but a lot of it is awareness, discipline, things like this. So again, ultimately, I don't think government policies alone can do the trick. I think we also as individuals need to be much more aware about sustainability, right? I mean, this kind of a course that allows you to listen to some of us and then have a discussion like this is one step, but we need a vast number of people who have sustainability front and center of their minds, because they've already been educated in it, for us to bring about a change. Otherwise, for every policy I can figure out a workaround, right? So that's not really going to make that much of a difference. Okay.
Thanks for that.
Great. Let's see other hands that are being raised. Sorry, I just lost that. Wait a second. Where are the... Okay, for whatever reason, that thing just disappeared. No, here we are. So, Dr. Pradeep.
Yes, good morning, sir. As a whole, agriculture emanates almost 18% of the gas emission, that is green gas emission. Do you have any data regarding the agriculture, that is the food industry, especially in India, emanates green gas emission? Do you have any research study in IIT Madras to calculate the grease emission from agriculture industry? Because number of agriculture or food industries are large, and so many people are involved, and we have to give proper awareness. Then only the grand gas emission can be curtailed or reduced in our India or state.
Yeah, so good point, sir. We have a couple of studies, and again, I'll try to send the links if I can. One was to look at a few different crops, so things like tomato and brinjal and so on, and try to sort of calculate what is the total emission from things like when you bring the seeds, you actually transport the seeds, then there is actual farming process, there is the harvesting process, there is post-harvesting transportation. In some cases, there might be cold storage, use of cold storage and things like that, until it at least gets up to the retailer. Past the retailer, it's very difficult to compute because each of us live in different places. who knows who is coming and picking up that tomato or whatever. But this kind of a study was done. And what was also done is to say, what happens if the farm holding is a typical rural farm, which is hundreds of kilometers away, versus a peri-urban farm, which is on the peripheries of the city. And clearly the peri-urban farm, because of the reduction in transportation, from a greenhouse gas perspective, performs far better than the traditional rural farm. And the whole point of this was to say, when we do land use planning, for instance, Chennai is coming up with a new master plan for 2020 in 2026, where they will be zoning. Obviously, the existing Chennai is built up. They will be zoning the outer area. That we could actually zone some areas into a urban agriculture kind of zone, so that we can reduce our footprint. So there is some of this kind of work that's been done. Also, agricultural waste is used as a byproduct in in building materials, for instance, and things like that. So again, we are trying to quantify a little bit of the life cycle or carbon footprint or impact of the agricultural waste per se, or the agricultural process and the waste that it sort of generates. So there are a few studies that we've been undertaking on that count. Hope that answers the question. We've got to see a few more hands up. I'm just trying to contact Satya because he'll also come and take over. Satya says he's online. Satya, are you here?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Great.
Yeah.
So Satya, what I'm going to do is maybe take a couple of questions or maybe one more question, and then I'll transition it over to you. Lots of questions. And in fact, a few of the questions that I fielded earlier were very energy related, particularly relating to the cement industry and so on. So I think some of those I'll ask, they could re-ask those questions to you. So let me sign off with SS70, and then we'll move over to Satya's question. So what we've been doing, Satya, is there are some people who are typing things on the chat, others are raising their hands. So we're just going in order and doing this. SS16, I believe you asked your question. So if I could just request you to lower your hand, that will be great. Yeah, thank you. SS70, please go ahead.
Yeah, good morning, sir.
Good morning. You're muted again, SS70. I can't hear you.
Hello. Good morning, sir. So I am working in the tire industry and more focused now on sustainability, circularity of waste material uses, and after forcing EPR in producer responsibility. So in this, we are facing two issues. First, when we are using recycled material, so property wise it is a lower. We are not getting similar property after using recycled material, even for lower PHR, lower thing. So can we? There is some group working on that to improve. There are so many, but we are working, but we are not getting exact similar material as a regular. And one question is that, and second, during calculation of carbon footprint, some data are very not accurate. Like we are not able to get data from any redesigned source. Like electricity, we are using electricity for our grid, but carbon footprint they are giving a country level, so it is not exact the same what we are using. So how we tackle this problem?
Yeah, in fact, I think that's a great question to segue to Satya with, because I think it also hits some of his points. So maybe I'll just start, give you a quick 30-second response to some of that, and then I will sort of leave and Satya can take over. But one way to do it is, and we'll talk a little bit about life cycle analysis and so on a little bit later in the course, I think the second or the third week. So we'll maybe revisit this. But one option, of course, is to go ahead and actually build those databases. So that's one of the things that we've been doing, at least for parts of the building sort of sector, saying we can't rely on some of this publicly available data because it may not be local. Even if it is in the India context, it's much more macro than what we are looking for. So can we actually go and trace processes? and see what exactly people are doing, what energy mix they are using, etc. And using that, calculate something that is there for local conditions, right? So I think that's one sort of way of doing this. But Satya, you might have some ideas, and what I'm going to
So,
do is I'll sign off as you sort of go
yeah.
ahead, and you can just take over. Thank you.
Thank you
I'll
very
see
much,
you all.
Ashwin.
Yeah.
There are two questions that was asked. One is the material properties of reused material. I think that's a problem globally everybody is trying to address. So it is evolving as we speak in terms of material substitution, utilization of lower grade materials for some applications where it is suitable. Second, in terms of the carbon footprint or emission factor of the grid, there are now very well established standards. So you don't need to necessarily use the national emission factor. There is a very clear methodology given as to how to calculate your own emission factor. It's basically a combination of entering the different sources of electricity that you are consuming. Let's say you have a 50% sourcing coming from the grid power, which currently the emission factor is about 0.7, 0.72, plus your own captive generation, say using solar PV, and wheeled in power, say using other renewable sources. You can arrive at your emission factor. So those computations are available. And this has been elaborately developed and approved by the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism Authority body, and that's what India is also following. So I think you should be able to use that. If you need further help, you can find these calculators available in the CEA, the Central Electricity Authority's website also. They give a huge Excel sheet which you can download and then understand where these things are coming from. So I'll go through a few of the questions in the in-call messages. I think Hussein has addressed SS70's question on material. Of course, traceability is an important element. That's where supply chain tracking and tracing supply chain becomes important, and that's a question, particularly when you're talking about scope 3 emissions. That's becoming an important element. Question by SS36 on qualifications needed for a sustainability officer. See, as of now, we don't have a necessary qualification like a certified energy auditor. But what sustainability is a combination of all of these. So if you look at the skill sets or skill matrix, it involves understanding high-level estimation of these kind of footprints. As I said, emission footprint, looking at wastewater circularity, wastewater treatment. So in an ability to do these kind of audits and assessments. So in that sense, being certified as a Bureau of Energy Efficiency energy auditor or energy manager gives you a lot of tools to do these kind of practices. So to that, if you can add on ability for you to audit material flows and water flows, you will be able to work on sustainability fairly well. I believe there is no curriculum as such to build on sustainability certifications. But what we are doing through this course, through the entire 4-week course, I think it will give you a fairly good idea on what does it take to practice sustainability. So this first week is the introduction, but there are specific modules on various elements of sustainability, which includes certification, reporting standards, toolkits, particularly one module on toolkits, which is I think module number 3, which allows you to understand these specific practices that you will need. And then the last module on case studies will help you how these are applied. So as a practitioner, you can develop as a practicing professional, like an assistant professor or so on, you can develop, but then certification we have to see.
Sir, one more doubt regarding that. I am Shabnam, like SS36. Like as a sustainable architect, I done my master's in sustainable architecture. I go through the syllabus like the introduction part of sustainability as we studied in module 1, and we studied about the LCA part. And I also know about the software regarding the Quest and all. So I know I already know about the like basic auditing things, and I worked under a sustainability consultant and in Ernakulam. So I know the basic things, bits and pieces from here and there. So what all add-ons that I may lead to these questions that I want to ask in this occasion.
So once you are aware of the basics, then there are 2 elements. So most of these softwares and most of the elements of this course is giving you what is the available data sets that you can use. Now, of course, the next and the biggest step in any kind of sustainability practices is to go towards implementation. So when you talk about implementation, the challenge is how do you track implementation? How do you validate those? So validation is a very big question mark. Even in energy, it is a very big question mark. And when it goes to other elements like social and governance, it becomes even more. So verification and validation are things that needs to be taken care of. And then doing an assessment and providing, saying that this is sustainable is one aspect of it. But then providing an implementation roadmap, providing some kind of a detailed assessment on cost benefit, and really looking at the reduction that has happened. So those are the areas that are further likely to grow, and more standards are likely to come. Right now, if you also look at it, there are guidelines, but there are no real big standards except energy and Energy Star rating. So other areas are also likely to start seeing more standards. Is that what I'm thinking? So I will,
sir.
yeah.
One
So
more doubt that I had.
you can come back later. I will, and there are many questions here. So maybe hold on to your question. We'll go one round and come back to you again. So I will read two more questions online on the chat window, and then it'll be easier for me to go there, and then I will come back to the hands raised. So I'm going to question by SS45. So it says to meet a 2030 and 2070 goal, what is the role of every individual to contribute to this, apart from efforts made by government, NGOs, non-profit, etc.? See, the pyramid of net zero is remaining the same. If you really look at net zero, it has maybe folks who are on listening mode. Can you mute, please? There's an echo. I request. Yeah. Thank you very much. So the pyramid of net zero, you will look at the approaches to net zero in a subsequent module, but I'll just briefly give you, there are four elements to it, right? First and foremost is using energy and resources better, which means not utilizing a very, very high grade, high quality energy for application that does not require it. A very good example is in industries, particularly when we use high grade fuels like diesel and kerosene to generate hot water, for example, 50, 60 degrees. That's what many industries used to do, but they are now migrating. The second one is energy efficiency. Though it might appear like individually, the benefit does not really seem to make a much big difference. Like, for example, if you switch from a normal fan to a BLDC fan, you might see like a 10-12% or a small like 1,000-2,000 rupee kind of a difference. But collectively, they add up significantly. And you might be knowing that the government has more or less mandated that going forward, all ceiling fans will be based on BLDC. The third thing that you can do is substitution, right? Looking at alternatives. For example, can you go on the grid? Particularly when you're talking about 2030 goals and 2070 goals on net zero, it is believed that electrification contributes significantly, because electrification will allow us to decarbonize our grid much faster and then thereby contributing to these goals. So electrification. And the last aspect is really looking at offsets. Offsets by plantations, offsets by afforestation. There are multiple more offsets that you can do, but that is primarily taking care of how do you handle your emission itself. So that's basically the approaches. And there are no policies at an individual level. These are more like guiding principles. So it's something that as an individual you do. Of course, there are incentives, right? The incentives are coming by way of tariffs. When you have electricity consumption going beyond 1,000 units, you pay a significantly stiff tariff. So some of those are enforced through revenue-based tariffs, but not necessarily through regulatory or statutory approaches. So question number 9, SS91. Difference between greenhouse gases and global warming protocol. See, there is no global warming protocol. There is a GHG protocol, which essentially means. Sorry, I missed a couple of questions in between. Let me go in order. Let me go to SS48. In the module defining sustainability, we go through routes and end up with a Venn diagram which has 4 sets and has a small portion which is common to all sets. Is it that there is no specific or clear definition of sustainability? That has been the challenge. I think in module 1, you already went through the roots of sustainability, where we had come through various approaches, and depending on the region, depending on the priority, depending on the levels of development, each of these are likely to become more. But what is commonly agreed on sustainability is that all of those four elements need to be taken care of. Now, and the levels at which they need to be taken care of are determined by nationally defined commitments. So there are certain, each and every country has a certain set of nationally defined commitments, which is what we adhere to. So there is sustainability, definition of sustainability still evolving. I don't think it will come to any kind of a specific statement as you would expect it to be. The reason is because it is very, very contextual. It is very sensitive to the geography. It is also very sensitive to the times in which the geography is. And you can imagine if somebody is at the level of $2 per day kind of an income, sustainability is for them primarily income sustainability and livelihood sustainability. Everything else comes secondary. And this is what we see in many industries in India as well, where their primary margins are very low, that for them, anything and everything is only after profitability, because there is no profitability, there is really no sustainability. So I think broadly, KPIs in that kind of a hierarchy is what we'll define. And what we are saying is that each of them contribute to sustainability, but when all of them can work together, you hit the sweet spot where everything is protected. The people, planet, prosperity, all of that is protected. So that's question SS48. I think I have SS91, difference between greenhouse gases and global warming protocols. Greenhouse gases are contributors. Global warming protocol, actually it is the GHG protocol. It's basically the kind of standards, because if you really look at it, I can define my own standards and start measuring my own and reporting my own basis. So to kind of standardize it is where the GHG protocol has been given. The GHG protocol basically defines three kinds of emissions. One is what they call a scope 1, which is your own process related emission. The second one is called scope 2, which is your energy related emission, which is imported electricity and certain set of fuels. And scope 3 is everything else. And within scope 3, they have 15 categories, which kind of defines different kinds of emissions. So that is the protocol. So it helps companies report on the same standard. So the idea behind the GHG protocol is to help companies report, and we can compare apple to apple. Two suppliers who are reporting, we can compare apple to apple. So that's where these different gases and different protocols are come in. So in terms of the next question, SS80, you're talking about my thoughts on science-based target initiative and from the perspective of assessment benchmarking. See, SBTI is probably one of the directions in which we are making sustainability actionable. Otherwise, many times what happens is I can put my wish list. For example, I can say I will reach 50 gigawatts of renewable and I will get 45% reduction. So all of these numbers need a specific backing, and the backing has to be based on science. One of the challenges that we have had is, for example, when people talk about say carbon offsets and planting trees for carbon offsets, there is no great agreed metric on how do you compute it and how do you validate it, because that you can say a tree can sequester for 280 kilograms in its lifetime, or it can sequester 50 kilograms a year. There are many, many numbers. And then the definition is based on the size of the tree and so on and so forth. And the second one is you also say that when I substitute fuels, for example, take the example of hydrogen, right? Right now, green hydrogen in India is defined as 2 kg per kg, 2 kg of CO2 emission per kg of hydrogen. But is that even meaningful? And we have done our analysis to say that that's extremely difficult unless you exclude everything else except the operational cost of the hydrogen production, which means only the energy cost, and that you are assuming energy comes from solar PV. So for a target setting, it is important to say that what you can achieve now by science that is available right now, and do scientific pathways that we know right now enable you to get there. And then you add to it the other elements of economics and the maturity of technology and return on investment and so on and so forth, that will allow us to do more precise implementation. But again, it also allows us to do more precise action. So that's where when we say I'm reducing my scope 1 and scope 2 to 100% net zero, then you really are putting it to say, what is that net zero? How do I measure it? How do I report it? And then how do I implement it? So these are the activities that is part of the SB. TI. And I think more and more as we start reporting sustainability, people will ask metrics, and the metrics has to be accepted by other people. And that's where this whole thing comes in. So let me pause here before I go on to newer questions. And there are many people who have their hands raised. So I will open the hand raise column. Sorry. Yeah, I'll go with Mr. Tirumurugan.
Yeah, good morning, Professor. I could see the energy storage and energy efficiency as one of the sustainability part in the essentials of sustainability. In that, there are a lot of energy efficiency techniques where you talk about smart grid to renewable energy. My question is related to how data analytics and machine learning in India probably contribute in terms of the sustainability actions, wherein which when the whole world talk on two things, one is the sustainability, which we are quite hearing for the last 2 years, and data is one thing which has been there for quite some time. How these two can be contributing mutually and with a lot of reflections where any company will have a target toward their sustainability goals. So are the corporates are adapting rapidly or still in the very early stage of machine learning? That is my question, Professor.
Okay. So excellent question, and that leads to an important point, right? One of the key pillars of sustainable transition is digitalization. And once you have a reasonable level of digitalization is where you're talking about data analytics, applying machine learning. So from a objective function, these are certain to improve your outcomes, particularly when you're talking about energy efficiency, looking at connected systems. Take, for example, a complex process like even vegetable oil processing, which involves multiple extraction, multiple heat exchangers, cooling, and all of that. You can obviously improve the system piecemeal. If you are doing it manually or through energy audits and so on, you can obviously improve systems location by location or station by station. But then to get a comprehensive view on the system and look at an optimal solution is something where these kind of tools will apply. And this becomes even more important in the current building stock. So building energy and sustainability of buildings, commercial buildings particularly, are going to be very, very important because I think there is a huge demand from cooling that's going to come on the grid. There again, these kind of tools play a big role. Having said that, if you really ask me, are we ready to take forward all of these actions? My answer is no, because of two reasons. One, we don't yet have enough data collection infrastructure, though you may say there is data available at different pieces and places. It is not in a form where it is useful. It is disaggregated, it is siloed, it is not in a form where you can draw inferences. So there's a lot of work that needs to happen. And second, the other challenge is there is also lack of standardization. For example, electricity is by and large measurable, metered, and there's accepted standards. Whereas other forms of energy, particularly when you look at compressed air, water, heating, cooling, and all, there is very little that you can measure effectively and then start improving things. So that is where it is. And the third aspect is also about the awareness in the market, right? We recently conducted a workshop on what we called as AI for net zero. Essentially, we looked at what is the role of artificial intelligence, particularly tools as data acquisition, the machine learning and data sciences are likely to play. The consensus was it is important because it unearths opportunities that is normally not done by simple monitoring and simple statistical regression based, not statistical, simple heuristic or rule based tools. And this is going to at least add another 15-20% to the improvement opportunity. But the challenges were that there is still also an ethical question where what will happen to the data if so much data is available? What is the challenge of it being misused, and what is the challenge of it being compromising the intellectual property of a particular company and so on? And this is where organizations have more or less boundary walled their whole data set and infrastructure. So it's something that needs to happen. It is also like human, but now we have more or less accepted giving data to anybody pretty much free of cost. But in these scenarios, it's still playing out. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you, Professor.
And I have Mr. Vedagiri, Sri Ganesh.
Yes, sir. Yeah, I have a couple of questions. One is like on the path of net zero journey, okay, when organizations were typically wanted to set a baseline year wherein they can measure it and track it, what would be the right methodology you would suggest? Like example, it should be pre-COVID or after COVID? Because after COVID, there are a lot of hybrid working model have been introduced for, especially for IT and ITS sector, wherein work from home also should be considered as part of your emissions, you know, like when people are working from home. So if IIT Madras, I don't know what you guys have taken as a baseline, and is there anything else, best practices you guys can give it to the forum, sir?
See, there are two ways to do this. One is we can follow the Government of India's NDC. So basically, the way this is working is all of our individual contributions towards achieving these 2070 and 2030 and so on goals is based on NDCs that India has committed. The Panchamrit goals that was done at COP26, and then followed on with the NDCs in COP27, and reaffirming that in COP28, which considers the baseline year as 2015. So worldwide, many companies also report that they will go to compared to a 2015 baseline, they will reduce it by 45%, or they will achieve net zero by so on. Now, the way, again, you can also define these are based on three factors, which includes what will be the scope 1 and scope 2 as it is defined right now, which is direct emissions, and scope 3, which is contributed emissions. In the case of an IT sector, there are guidelines that is, I mean, it is on both ways. One, if an employee is doing work from home, there are now methodologies to assess that working from home and use that particular emission factor of that hours used. So 8 hours or 10 hours, and you assume a nominal emission factor that is used, and then you add it to your own scope 1 emission. Because scope 1 is all emissions that is towards delivering your goods and services. So that's what it is. And everything else is in scope 3. So in terms of your baseline, I mean, that is really a management priority, because many companies are reporting right now based on 2021. So there is one case study that will be presented in this workshop, in this certificate course, in the 4th module, where we talk about Unilever as an example, where how they have taken different years for different baselines and how they are tracking those progress. So basically, they are saying that they will get to a scope 1 and scope 2 neutrality before the end of this decade, and at least 70% scope 3 neutrality in another 10 years. That's their global commitment. But there is also this challenge where companies like, again, Unilever, their scope 1, scope 2 contribution is only about 2%, whereas bulk of their emission is coming from scope 3, because they depend entirely on vendors.
Okay, sir. So basically, you're saying that it is depends on the management priority. So
it is based on what your public commitment. So companies like Infosys, for example, they started with an RE100 commitment, and now they are periodically upgrading their commitment on the basis of that. And most of it started in 2015. So okay, now I have one more person. I think.
Sorry, one more follow-up is like on your lecture, there is one statement you said on human beings are 80% fossil energy. You know,
right.
I'm not. I don't understand clearly. Can you please explain that?
Very much. So most of food we consume has fertilizer built into it, which is primarily ammonia-driven, and most of ammonia-driven fertilizer are from methane, which is cracked to produce hydrogen. And that hydrogen is combined with nitrogen in a Haber-Bosch process to produce ammonia, and that ammonia is utilized for fertilizer production. And worldwide, all of this is coming from fossil energy. So that's why most of the food we consume, we don't consume food produced completely with natural fertilizers, and it is very, very difficult right now. So most of what we consume, which makes up entire mass of our body, is basically from fossil energy.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Excellent. So I will now SS 99. I have one hand up.
Yeah, good morning, Dr. Satyanarayanan. I'm J.
Yeah.
Jagan from Flex Chennai.
Okay.
So most of the companies publish annual sustainability report regularly. So is there any mandatory reporting system to publish by every MNCs quarterly or annually? Because you slightly touched on the global reporting system on CDP, BRSR, GRI, SASB, etc. Do we deep dive on those measurements in the upcoming courses so that we can learn that reporting systems?
Yes, there is a deep dive. There are a few practitioners who are doing a deep dive on this reporting system. In India, it is BRSR, which is mandated by the top 25 listed companies. I think it's expanding to include more. And BRSR is broadly derived on the GRI reporting initiative. And deep dive on that, it is going a little bit. I mean, you will get a little bit more exposure into those reporting in subsequent modules.
Thank you.
And as a part of our larger course that we are likely to offer as a follow-up next year, we'll have a much expanded modules on specifically reporting. Okay, so I'll take two more raised hands before I go on to the comments. Mr. Anup Kumar. Okay, Mr. Anup Kumar is muted. I'll go to Mr. Kunal, SS17.
Hello. Yes, good morning, Professor.
Yeah.
I'm Kunal Krishna. I'm working with defense industry and presently posted at Pune. So I teach students about construction planning and basically military officers and structural design. So my question is regarding the Panchamrit action plan. And for us, like you said, they are been substituted with NDC.
Okay.
So, what are the major differences between these two? Panchamrit action, I know.
Right. So, see, Panchamrit was basically at that point, it was stated as a goal. So, there were no, if you really look at it in COP26, India said they will reach these targets, but it was not committed. So, NDC is more like a signatory. So, it's basically put it on paper. So Panchamrit broadly, NDC and Panchamrit are not very different. They are very, very similar. The NDCs are basically making it more actionable. And it derives from the Panchamrit.
Okay, sir. So, has there any action, like there is a Panchamrit broad-based action plan has been made that to eliminate fossil fuel, to reduce carbon intensity and greenhouse emission.
Right.
So, there were 5 nectar elements primarily.
Right.
So,
yes.
So, is there a master plan which has been given?
It is. It is. Right now, it is driven through Bureau of Energy Efficiency. You might be aware that it was this whole commitments were heavily dependent on two pillars. One is adding renewables, and the other one is reducing the intensity of emission intensity of manufacturing, which was also related to the energy intensity of manufacturing. So the Bureau of Energy Efficiency's PAT scheme, which has now been upgraded to a CCTS, which is carbon credit trading scheme, is targeting those particular actions on reducing carbon intensity by two mechanisms. One is providing incentives to reduce, and the second one is imposing penalties on emissions. So these are, as usual, targeted against the DCs or designated consumers, as the government of India defines it. Very, very high intensity sectors like aluminium, steel, cement, and so on. And now for them, these are mandatory. And for all the other sectors, now this has become a voluntary. So there is a voluntary CCTS scheme that is also being rolled out. So this is driven at a policy level by carbon credit opportunities. And then at a action and implementation level, there are a couple of schemes available through Bureau of Energy Efficiency through a cluster-wide approach, looking at energy-intensive clusters like textile, paper, ceramics, cold storages, and all, and providing specific solutions to address them. So there is also a Global Energy Fund GEF version 6. Version 5 was done. Now version 6 is in progress. So there's large amount of what is called as demonstration projects that are now taking place. Now the intention is, as these demonstration projects kicks in, the government is also launching a scheme called as the Aditi scheme, which is essentially supporting interest subvention for energy efficiency projects. So if your project is 10% efficient, you get like a 4% interest subvention. If your project is 15% efficient, you get a 6% interest subvention. And if it's about 20% efficient, you get like a 8% interest subvention, which means the loans that you borrow for energy efficiency project are more or less free of cost. So these are some of the actions that are currently in the pipeline or already being executed by the government.
That's very good information, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So, additionally, there is some study to be done by Indian Army. So, can I get in touch with you?
Absolutely, absolutely, anytime. So we have an energy cell, very large. Yeah, you can find it online. We have a large energy cell at IIT Madras, which does energy assessment, sustainability assessment for industries across the country. IIT Madras is the main center, but we also have centers across the country in IIT Bombay, Gandhinagar, Ropar, Indore, Hyderabad, and Guwahati, so that we cover the entire nation in terms of all of these sectors.
Right,
so you should be able to find it. Satya, SATYA @IITM.ac.in.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much.
So I'll go on to a few questions on the chat window now. So I stopped at ST, the science-based initiatives. Now I'll come to Mr. Hussein's question. Hussein is addressing that. Mr. Vedagiri, he said some debate about EV vehicles are more material intense during manufacturing compared to petrol. See, it always happens, right? So our energy systems is not completely decarbonized. So that's the reason why even when I talk about green hydrogen, I said if I consider all material intensity and everything, green hydrogen is reasonably intensive. It's minimally you require about 4.5 kilograms of CO2 emission per kg of hydrogen. But the intention is the fastest way to decarbonize an economy or energy system is to electrify it, because we right now know that there are mechanisms to there are pathways to reducing the carbon intensity of the manufacturing itself. So first you take care of the utilization, and then you go back to the sources. So that's, I think it will happen. So it's a question of time and not a question of whether it is sensible or not. Legacy models, currently, when you look at the current state of the art, it will be like that, because these are energy systems built over the last 250 years. Now we are only talking about electrification in the last 15-20 years. So it's going to take some time to catch up before this entire system changes over. And as I said, even in sectors like steel manufacturing, there is heavy focus towards electricity-driven steel manufacturing. So there are typically the existing process such as electric arc furnace, you already know, but there is even electrolytic steel making. There are a couple of work that is happening in CSIR labs and also in companies across the world. So it is on the process there. So I have Mr. Anup, any scientific calculations for awareness of end users on waste management? So there are calculation available. There is a carbon footprint calculator that is available online. But then, there is also an NITI Aayog's effort that came out called Life Initiative last year. But it's a question of conscious choices, Even right now, it is very, very hard to understand, but it's a question of conscious choices. So, there is enough number of research papers and enough number of white papers and enough number of material available. I think here it's very, very individualistic, where you collectively, you individually do what you want to do and then collectively implement, because I don't think there is any other way except particularly in a country like ours where it is so diverse and so wide, it's no way to impose it top down. It only has to be bottom up. There are very good examples that you can see in terms of lake rejuvenation that has happened, in terms of organic farming that has happened. I think it's a question of how do we manage it. I'll give you anecdotally now. I think our plastic reduction has come reasonably down, at least in many of our commercial utilization. Recently, I was on travel to Singapore, and I was really shocked by the amount of plastic they use, because their intention is the plastic doesn't show up in our waterways because we burn it, and incineration is what they are using to dispose of their waste. I think it is extremely wasteful and not really sustainable. So, but then if you go to talk to people in Singapore, I did ask them, and they said they are very sustainable because they are protecting the oceans. They are protecting the blue ocean. They are protecting marine life and all of that. So in their mind, they are completely sustainable, and they are preventing food waste because packaging helps reduce food waste and all of that. So there is no way to really say this is what needs to be done. But I think we know what is the general direction, which is reducing waste going to landfill. So that's what we need to do. I'll take up a question by Mr. Gopal Chavan. what is the volume of efforts or urgency that is needed to sustainability issues, because it normally comes last. See, right now, the way to address these issues is not as an afterthought. I think these have to be addressed in design. So, particularly greenfield projects and greenfield designs of products and so on, if you can address it in design, that will be perfect. The cost required to address it in design is much, much lower than the cost it requires to address it later. So if you can think of circularity in design, if you can think of how do you use materials that can sustainably be disposed, or how do you use as little resources as possible, that is good. In terms of brownfield projects, unfortunately, we may talk about many things, but economics is still what determines, because as a consumer, we are not really willing to pay a bit more on what probably sustainably produced or sustainably sourced. A very simple reason that we don't believe it. So, for example, how do I know that the material that has been provided to me at a premium is sustainably done? So I don't want to be fooled. I don't want to be taken for a ride. So I do not want to pay the premium. And this has been the same problem with organically sourced food. I mean, how many of us are willing to pay a significant premium on organic food? We don't do that because we don't believe that it is completely organic. So I think it is a matter of economics that needs to work out. But since a lot of India is yet to be built, including building stock and all of that, we could potentially address this at the greenfield project starting with. So I think that makes it a lot more sensible. While from the brownfield projects, we try to minimize the waste being generated as economically as possible. So a lot more questions, I think, coming up my way. So I will take ESG for SS48 ESG. Is the ESG drive any specific sequence, or see in ESG? If you really look out, the S and G part are something that as a responsible business you're already doing. S is the social part, which is heavily driven through CSR and other activities. G is typically governance, which is enforced by ROCs and other activities. I mean, of course, there are now other elements of governance coming in, other elements of society coming in, like gender equality and so on. But broadly, this reporting, and broadly it is board managed, meaning governance driven, both of them. Whereas the E part is where action takes place mostly, because E part is the environmental part. Though in terms of reporting, it only out of the, I think, 9 reporting principles, the E part only covers 2 reporting principles, which is 2 and 6, I think. But then it essentially impacts a lot of our interaction with the environment. So actions as you would take from a field level, actions as you would take from a upper management, middle management level is on E part. The S and G part is broadly about the boardroom activity, where the principles are there, and our objective at a operational level is to ensure that the S and G are adhered to in all our transactions. So now this question on, isn't scope 3 a part of scope 2 of someone else and scope 1 of someone else? It's absolutely true. It's absolutely true. There is, it is part of it. But since our estimations are more or less not interconnected as of now, we do that. There is some scope for duplication, but I think there is mechanisms to address duplications. But broadly, the way it is done is you look at your supply chain and you account for any duplication of the supply chain. So most often what happens is, once you, for a particular company which is at the top end of the supply chain, which goes to the consumer, they kind of look for all of these duplication, because otherwise their footprint appears to become very, very large. So they take care of this duplication. Until we get a completely integrated model, we are yet to work on this particular feature, which is currently, I think, being taken care of. We are currently working on a model which we call as the climate action tool, which takes care of most of these anomalies as well. So probably I don't have any hands up, so I will go on with the questions. What is scope 1, 2, and 3? I've already addressed that question. Some books to read. I mean, there are not many books to read, but in the module itself, I have talked about where these material came from, the convention. There are certain set of publications that are available. So I will ask our TAs and our team to post the link to those publications that you can read. There is a new GHG proposal for scope 4. I haven't gone through it in detail, so I'm not able to comment. Let me read that and I will come back to you in terms of scope 4. SS57, what were the challenges due to which GPI could not become popular as compared to GDP? Are there any countries? See, GDP is a simple measure. Essentially, it's something which is tangible, which I can measure because there is an economy, there is tax collection, there is a KPI that is cleanly measurable. Whereas with GPI, which is progress indicator, which is very hard, right? Progress is very subjective and it could include well-being, well-being. For example, this has been a problem in terms of malnutrition, right? What was considered malnutrition, and this is right now is where the corrections are happening, where almost all of Indian children born were considered premature, preterm, meaning low birth weight at birth, because almost all of them were less than 3 kilograms at birth, whereas the global standard was 3 and above. So which made most of Indian kids born as low birth weight, which was then linked to the malnutrition of maternal and all of that. But then now it is understood that the Indian type is that the children are not necessarily 3 kilogram, but between 2 and 2.5 kilogram. Some corrections are being made. There is now India-specific maternal health standard that are being developed, and India-specific screening tools that are being developed by a project called Garbini and so on. So I think this is where the challenge comes in. This is where, because each country can put its own criteria to measure and report that they are very, very good. And the rating itself broadly comes from ability for investment and capital flows to go in. It basically is a proxy for if this country is growing or not. If it is growing, can I invest? So that's why GDP still is sticking. I don't know whether any other measures are equally easy to convey and equally easy to model, because if you go to any other measures, the modeling is becoming difficult, and then you can't assess a credit rating for a company and so on. So I think it will still continue, but people continue to report, like you say, you have this happiness index and people list reports saying the most livable cities and all of that parameters are coming, but that's not really used for the important decisions such as whether investment should flow to this country, whether FDI should go in, whether the country should have a BBB or BBB minus or BBB plus ratings and all of that. So now I will go to one hand raised question, SS8.
Yeah, good morning, Professor. See, in one of the, I hope I'm audible, right?
Yeah, you're audible. Please go ahead.
Okay. In one of the videos, we actually saw that when it comes to sustainability, design is a big lever compared to what we are doing, some kind of retrofits here and there. But when we look at a business perspective, it's like who will build the cat? Because when we are trying to redesign whole of the stuff, it takes time, it takes money, and I would not like to be the first. So it looks for something like partnership that SDG 17 is talking about, but practically things are not happening. What do you think is possible, scenarios when those things can happen? Because it has been a lot of greenwashing than maybe the practical stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's a question of a couple of things that will drive this. One, unless and until the color of money becomes important. For example, if funding becomes expensive for companies that are reporting low on sustainability through a very measurable, trackable systems, or funding becomes cheaper for companies that measure, so that the cost of doing this activity is kind of offset by access to cheaper capital. Now, such mechanisms are becoming available, so it's not yet widespread. And you already know that though the developed world committed close to $1 trillion of grant flow to sustainable practices, only about 100 billion has been deployed. And even in that 100 billion, most of it is debt. So there is, unless and until the banks start imposing those kind of behavioral changes, it is unlikely to happen at a very wide level. Having said that, there are certain micro choices you could do. One, for example, is the CFO's office could be recommended
to look at a slightly longer payback period. For example, instead of a strict 18-month payback period, you could look at a 36-month payback period, which is still very, very attractive in terms of return on money invested. To look at a 36-month payback period for projects that are certified to be sustainable. That is a boardroom decision that can be taken, which does not really impact most of it, but it's a capital allocation that you could do. The second aspect that you could also do is to improve on, there are a lot of low-cost approaches to sustainability. Not all of it requires a heavy investment of capital. One of which is, we touched upon it earlier in the discussion, which is digitization and even simple act of measurement and tracking. So that in our wide assessment of industries, particularly the small and medium scale industries, what we find lacking is a significant assessment and tracking mechanism of practices. So that itself will give you a 7 to 12% boost on your sustainability and emission factor scores. So I think it's that particular awareness, and as you start looking at benefits, I think the second aspect of convincing your CFOs to expand their payback period and now starting to access those finance that is available for more green rated companies is what something I would think of. But you're absolutely right. The chicken or an egg problem or bell the cat problem, it still exists unless somebody is paying the money.
True. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so I will take one online. The comment here is atmospheric water generator friendly, environment friendly. I mean, if you simply look at the thermodynamic logic of it, it doesn't make sense. Your RO treatment consumes only about 0.08 kilowatt hour per liter of water, whereas your atmospheric generation unit consumes about 0.2 units per liter of water. So it's almost 20-25 times more energy intensive. So from that perspective, it's only a life-saving measure, but it's not a measure to generate water. I don't think thermodynamics really supports it. So it's more like a fancy stuff. And unless you are looking at mechanisms that they have done in the desert where it is not doing any active generation of water, but it's putting out membranes in the field and it's just trapping the fog that is being generated and capturing water. That is completely passive. So such mechanisms are certainly interesting, but not to run an active machine which consumes power and generates water. In that case, I would simply treat seawater, and it is a lot more efficient from a material energy perspective. From a data perspective, identifying which data to collect is one aspect, while validating authenticity of data collected is other. For instance, in the case of electricity, install meter, the government ensures accuracy. See, electricity, yes. So electricity, all meters that are sold has to have a class certification. You might be aware of it, which is like a class B, class A, class C. So if you have a class certified meter, a reasonable accuracy and measurement is guaranteed. And these meters are also calibrated so that you can verify those devices. And then for certification, the instrument that are to be used for certification also has this requirement of an NABL or some kind of NABL or some kind of a certification requirement. I think that addresses the quality of data perspective. But the bigger question is how do we address the traceability? So just because we measure and qualify, it doesn't mean that we have traceability of data. I think some documentation is there, but not necessarily for all the utilities. So we broadly look at elements from electricity, heating, cooling, and water, and of course compressed air as well. But I don't think all of that is available. Electricity is fairly robust, and that's probably relating to most of your energy consumption. So I think that's there. So then following up on the GPI question, in the near future, could there be a mixed way of reporting, which includes qualitative and quantitative factors? I think so. Yeah, there could be a mixed way of reporting for many of these factors. However, I think financial decisions are likely to be made still using financial metrics. So I don't see a way around it particularly, because each of them have a different ruler. There is no standardized ruler. And except financial metrics, everything else is to be disputed and debated. So I really don't know. But from a well-being perspective, I think other metrics are also likely to be installed. Particularly when you don't like only GDP as a number, you might report other things. So let me talk about. Let me take a question from SS30 who has a raised hand.
Hi, good afternoon, Professor. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah. So I'm Srinidhi. I wanted to follow up a little on one of the questions that you had answered before this. My question in general is, how do you push banks and financial institutions to invest in sustainability, in companies which are trying to drive sustainability within them? Because generally what is observed is that when there is a certain push to adaptation to, towards sustainability from other companies, your profitability in general during the initial year sort of goes down. And then banks also tend to be a little risk averse. They will want to focus more on lending towards companies which are a little more profitable rather than thinking of the sustainability perspective, but rather on the profitability aspect of things. And to my they generally tend to be risk averse in these in general. So what do you think is something that can push banks to push towards investing in sustainability?
So, so far banks have, this is a question that we have also been asking. In fact, one of the corporates that CSR funded our energy efficiency project is a bank, Kotak Bank, that has supported us to establish all of these centers. So for them, the easiest is to look at projects that anyway make sense and, by the way, contribute to sustainability as well. So bulk of energy efficiency project and improvement projects that again reduces energy intensity and contributes to sustainability fall in that category. And there is also now this scheme that is Government of India is pushing towards providing some kind of interest subvention and then validating technology and kind of this credit guarantee schemes that they provide, partial risk guarantee scheme for certain capital investment. These are ways by which the Government of India is putting in. Now, the challenge in terms of corporates accessing those schemes has been that what I have found is the hesitancy in putting together the documents and really pushing forward, because I think what they almost always assume is that schemes are not going to come through. And the essentially, with having tried to push it across at least 190 such companies, what we have found is there is a lot of hesitancy in putting in effort towards availing those schemes. While it is available, I think the paperwork and the uncertainty about how long it will take and all of that kind of prevents people from accessing those schemes is what I believe. In terms of pushing banks, I think banks are also struggling. There is every bank that I know have now engaged with one or the other consultant to come up with a sense of how to handle ESG reporting and how to handle these green financing and all of that. The reason is very simple. The reason is the places where these banks raise their capital, like Bank of England and others, are now mandating that the banks also report their footprint of their assets that they manage, which includes the loan book and which includes the building footprint and all of that. So it is happening, and it is happening through the kind of capital that is being raised. But in the short term, I would still think that the current Government of India schemes that are available to support such initiatives by providing risk guarantee, by providing some partial funding support, and by also providing this interest subvention are ways to go forward.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Okay. So I think we are almost running out of time. I'll also have to log off right now, but then I'll take one question, which is there are so many standards, CDP, TFT, CFD, GRI, GHG, and all of that. How will we handle evolving standard? If you are in India, our standard is BRSR. So we don't have to worry about all of these things. BRSR is our standard. And BRSR standards maps nicely with the GRI standard. Now there are consultants and software being available that allows you to convert from one reporting standard to the other reporting standard. Because if you imagine, the data is more or less the same. I mean, whatever be the standard, the data is what you're collecting, and it's only a reporting framework. So we have to worry about BRSR and go through it thoroughly and understand that what is required. But then there are now companies that will help you map it to other standards, particularly if you are exporting to Europe. You have the requirement of GRI in most places. If you are accessing global capital, then you have to comply with the TCFD. So I think those are possible. RO wastewater common scenario at all households. My comment, in my house, I have let the RO wastewater go back to the well. So if you have an opportunity to put it back into the ground, please do that. It's not bad because most of our, if you can avoid RO, because most of our water, particularly in places like Chennai, has a TDS of less than 300 or max of 400. So if you can use it as such, it will be perfect. If you cannot, your treated RO water itself still has a TDS of less than 1000. So you can put it back in the ground. Anything less than TDS of 2000 or lower can be put back into the ground. Ammonia as a fuel, I also like ammonia as a fuel. As a researcher, I work on ammonia as a fuel, but it is challenging, it is toxic, it is material corrosive. So I believe that for passenger vehicles, EV is likely to become much more dominant, especially with the maturity in super fast chargers, 5-minute charging and all. I think that technology is maturing super fast, and solid state batteries are more or less becoming a reality very soon. So I think EV is there to stay. This is my opinion. Hydrogen is not likely for passenger vehicles. Ammonia certainly not for passenger vehicles. Maybe for large engines, maybe for marine vessels, maybe for freight transportation, but not certainly for passenger vehicles. Primarily because that ammonia leak can be very, very nasty. Industries have been handling ammonia for quite some time, but they handle it in extreme precaution. So I don't really think it's going to become handling it in petrol pumps. See, petrol is explosive, but it's not toxic. Whereas ammonia is combustible and also toxic. So that's where the challenge comes in. I think I will take one last question by Mr. Mohan Raj. Opportunity for a suggestion. I think lack of certified devices and opportunity for businesses to address. Certainly, I think it is there. It's an emerging opportunity. You will have to bet on it. And of course, there are many low-hanging fruits and which we can take. Constructing new building itself. So there is already a mandate right now for solar building. So if you have an apartment, I think before you can get your building completion certificate, you need to have a solar panel installed. So these are coming up. So, but then there are also conflicting regulations. For example, in Tamil Nadu, there is a network charge, which kind of negates the whole reason of putting your own solar PV. So this is a space that we are contesting. So there is a mix of incentives and disincentives, and there is a challenge that rooftop space is not being available. And sometimes when you put a solar panel, the space underneath is considered within your FSI. So each and every department of the government is operating in silos. So I think there is a requirement for the industry body and the community to put forward proposals. But I think it will happen. It will certainly happen. And yeah. All right. I think we are at the end of the hour. Thank you very much for such a wonderful interaction. We have the WhatsApp chat that is also provided here. Link is there. You please join the group, post your messages. We'd be happy to respond. You can reach out through email and write to us if there are any specific detailed discussions that you would like to have. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the course. Looking forward to see you in the next live session as well.
Thanks, Professor.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.